Alright guys, welcome to another video on Jujutsu Kaisen Phantom Parade. And in this video, I'll be doing a quick guide on how does domain expansion work in this game. Now, just like the series, basically domain expansion is not something everyone can do. There's only a handful of people who are capable of doing domain expansion. And right now on the global version, there is only Mahito, Hanami, Jogo, and also Incomplete Domain Megumi. So those are the only characters who are able to do domain expansion. However, obviously we already know from JP, in the future, there's also going to be Domain Gojo and also Sukuna. So there will definitely be more characters capable of doing domain expansion in the future. And they all kind of share similar kind of mechanics, which is that their domain expansion is essentially going to be the ultimate attack that they are able to use. Now, the actual effect of domain expansion is obviously going to be different per character, right? It's basically their ultimate skill, so it's going to be different every single time. But they all share very similar mechanics. And I'm just kind of briefly talk about, what is kind of the common mechanics that all of them share. Number one, I guess, is that all of those characters is going to have a really high ultimate gauge, definitely higher than your average character out there. And the idea is that you shouldn't be able to use domain expansion so easily, otherwise be too broken. Then the second thing is that domain expansion, when you actually use it, it tends to do some kind of attack on the turn you activate it. But what's more important is also activate the domain expansion itself, which is basically going to give you some effect, which is not just for that turn, but also lasts for multiple turns. I think vast majority of the time it is 4 turns. That's roughly the space of the domain expansion, like how long it lasts. And the actual effect, once again, is going to be different per character, but it tends to be some kind of either buff to yourself or some kind of debuff to the enemies, etc. And that basically just gives you a huge advantage in the battle itself. Something else that they all share in common is that when domain expansion is actually out, you won't be actually able to gain your own ultimate gauge during that time, and even after domain expansion has been lifted, normally you won't be able to gain ultimate gauge straight away as well. And once again, that's basically preventing you from spamming domain expansion back to back, and that will just make it too broken. So that's basically the main mechanics of domain expansion. Now, earlier today, I released a video on basically how I managed to override the enemy's domain expansion with my own, and basically that is going to be one key concept of domain expansion as well. And just like how they explained it in the original series, basically the one with a more refined domain expansion normally tend to win during a battle or clash of two domains. And when we actually talk about what does more refined domain expansion mean in this game, it's basically going to be a combination of the level of your own skill and also the curse energy that is going to be required. And what you will see is actually that basically in a nutshell, the higher your ultimate skill is, the less curse energy is going to be required for you to actually override the enemy domain. And in some stages, what's going to turn out is that the enemy's domain is so strong that it requires massive amount of curse energy for you to actually override it, which is actually higher than what's physically possible. And what you're going to see, for example, I would show you guys a few clips where I actually tested domain expansion at different levels. But basically, what you see is that, for example, if my domain expansion is only at level 8, if I actually want to override the enemy's domain, it requires 112 curse energy. However, the maximum amount I can actually get on my Mojito is only 110. And that basically means that there's just no way for me to actually override the enemy's domain when it's only level 8. And that's basically something you have to bear in mind. Now, something else which is also somewhat cool is that when the enemy's domain expansion kind of move on. So for example, it's not on the first turn of the domain, but on the second turn of the domain, the curse energy required is actually going to reduce. And basically you can think of it as, the enemy already used up a lot of curse energy to expand their domain, and some time have passed, therefore they go a bit weaker and the domain is a bit weaker. And therefore it wouldn't cost as much curse energy for you to actually override it. So earlier when I said, you need level 9 to actually override the enemy's domain, what I mean is that to do that on the first turn. However, if you're only level 8, you won't be able to overwrite on the first turn because you won't have enough curse energy. However, then on the second turn, you may actually have enough in order to actually then overwrite the enemy's domain. And that's once again a pretty cool concept that this game have. Now, in terms of overwriting domain, it's not just about overwriting the enemy's domain expansion as well. You can actually overwrite your own teammate's domain expansion, and that's actually a really cool concept, especially in the Mojito stall strategy, where you tend to play Mojito and also Hanami together. And the thing here is that even though Mahito is able to use a very strong domain expansion, the main strength of that domain expansion is actually on the first turn when he's able to do some damage, which is scaling off the enemy's HP rather than scaling off on the duration of the domain. And what that basically means is that the vast majority of the time after the first turn of Mahito's domain expansion, you don't really care about that domain anymore. And it's actually really annoying because during that time, even though you don't really care about its buff or debuff, etc., you won't be able to actually increase your ultimate gauge, and then even for 2 turns afterwards, you won't be able to increase your ultimate gauge. And that's actually very annoying. And what you will tend to see is that you actually, in those scenarios, want to use Hanami's own domain expansion to actually override Mahito's domain expansion, and that basically allow your Mahito to increase his ultimate gauge a few turns earlier, and therefore actually allow him to use it again later on much quicker. And that's basically a strategy you can actually use quite a few times. And basically this idea of actually replacing your own character's domain expansion, it's going to be slightly different mechanics to actually replacing the enemies. Because like what I said earlier, when we're actually trying to replace enemies domain expansion, basically the one which is more refined is going to win. However, when you actually try to replace your own teammates domain expansion, it seems like any kind of domain would work. And basically this can be shown when you actually take a look at incomplete domain Megumi's domain expansion. Basically, if you actually read the description for his skill, what you say is that this will always be replaced if any other domain expansion exists. And I mean, the idea is quite simple, right? This is an incomplete domain expansion, so there's no way it can win up against complete domain expansion. So if you actually want to use incomplete domain Megumi's domain expansion to overwrite, for example, Jogo's domain expansion in EX2 stages, what's going to turn out is that you probably need something ridiculous like 300 curse energy, which we all know is just physically impossible when the maximum curse energy incomplete domain can have, Megumi can have, is only 90, right? So it's just basically not going to be feasible for incomplete domain Megumi to actually override enemies' domain expansion. However, if you are actually replacing your own teammates, one of my viewers actually informed me that he actually used level 8 Megumi's domain expansion to override his own teammates Mahito's level 10 domain expansion. So what that seems to say is that even though this is incomplete domain, this is only if you actually competing up against the enemy's domain expansion. If you actually want to override your own teammates domain expansion, the level requirement doesn't really seem to matter, and that's kind of why even for an incomplete domain such as the one Megumi have, is still able to override a much higher level one that Mahito or Hanami will be having. Let me show you some footage now of where I was testing domain expansion so you can actually see for yourself how does the ultimate level get tied up with the curse energy required, etc. in order to actually override domain. So basically in this stage right now, Jogo just released his domain expansion, and I do have the ultimate skill ready for my Mahito to use domain expansion as well. However, I'm not sure whether you can see the number here, but it says I need 142 to actually override it, and this is because my domain expansion is only at level 7, and obviously even though my curse energy is maxed out at 110, that's not going to be enough to actually overwrite it. And once again, this is just basically showing at level 7, it's just not possible to actually override the enemy's domain expansion on the very first turn. And now let me show you the second footage where I actually leveled up my Mahito's ultimate level to level 8, and now let's see what happens. So Jogo once again uses domain expansion. Right now I have my Mahito's ult ready, and the number, I don't know what you can see here, it basically says it needs 112 to actually override the enemy's domain, and this is because my ultimate attack is now at level 8. And once again, if you actually compare to the requirement at level 7, you already see immediately that it's going to be a lot lower, and therefore there's the possibility of me actually overriding it, but it's still not quite enough because the maximum curse energy Mahito can have is only 110. So even if I have it at level 8 and the requirement is slightly lower, it's still going to be more than what Mahito is able to do on the very first turn. So instead, let's wait for one extra turn and then see what happens. One extra turn has gone past, the domain effect is now a bit weaker, and now what you can see is that the requirement to actually use domain expansion is only 92, and now all of a sudden we can actually overwrite it again with just level 8 domain expansion on the second turn.